What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're taking a look at the new PC port here, God of War Ragnarok on the ROG Ally X. And I'm really focused on 1080p performance because it's actually pretty impressive with and without in-game frame gen using FSR 3.1. And we'll talk about 720p and 900p as well when we get more into it. But let's go ahead and start with the performance of the game here. Now, as far as settings go, you can see we're going to start off with the 1080p. AMD FSR 3.1, and we're going to be using balanced when we get into it here. I have medium and low mixed here, medium textures and medium filter here, medium on ambient occlusion. You can, of course, adjust these to your liking when you get into it. Now, running full native is not going to be the way to go with 1080p or 900p, but if I go in here and you can see live changes in the game, which is awesome. We'll switch to quality and we'll gain almost 10 FPS, 9 or 10 FPS there just by going to quality, which is really great. We'll go to balanced and we'll gain a couple more, giving me about 12 FPS, which is what I'm actually going to wind up settling on for 1080p. Performance will gain us some more, but you'll see the details there in the grass and stuff on the right hand side really start to suffer, along with ultra performance, which brings us all the way up to 47 FPS. But with that blurrier image quality, you'd be better off with 900p or 720p. So I'm going to go 1080p balanced here just to check out the performance with my mix of the medium-low settings here that we were looking at. Now, of course, you can go in and tweak these live as well and see what kind of performance changes you'll get. Shadows by far are the ones you want to stay away from because they hit you the worst. But you can mess with atmospherics and some tessellation and stuff like that, some lighting if you want to play around with that, especially if you go to the lower resolutions. But sticking with what I've got here on the 3.1 balance, 25 watts, 8 gigs of VRAM, 1080p, low medium settings. Performance is pretty good. You're going to see some dips. This game will have all of a sudden sometimes in certain areas dip down to 28 30 FPS and then it'll recover and do fine, but a majority of the time, and probably 90-95% of my time playing the game, 6-7 hours in on the handhelds here and on the Ally X, it would rarely go that low, and it would also rarely ever stutter, which I attribute to not only being a great PC port so far, but also the 24 gigabytes of shared RAM we have on the Ally X, allowing us to really use up for 1080p all the RAM we need, with over 7 gigs used for the 1080p and almost 15 on the system. So a 16 gig system, which I have been testing, does suffer a little bit and stutter from time to time if you're playing on the OG Ally or the Legion Go, but I have some videos on that and we'll get more into that in the future as well. But here on the X, performance is really clean, it's really good here. Pretty happy with the 1080p and the 25 watts. You can get away with 20 watts as well, but that works better at the 900p or 720p, and I really wanted to showcase this performance. Why? Because, man, we've really been having to test a lot of games at 720 and 900, and while that's fine, I just was really happy that we actually had a game here that we could do some 1080p gaming for the native display, the VRR display, which works really great on here. Also, just roaming around different areas of the game, again, your performance is really going to vary, and you may certainly opt to do 900p or 720p, but I thought this was pretty impressive performance to take a look at and see what the device was capable of and how smooth the gameplay actually is doing this at 1080p. Now, of course, we talked about 720p and 900p. 720p is definitely a good way to go if you want to get the maximum frame rate. We're actually at FSR quality here. It looks really good. You could even do some native 720p or tweak some things that direction if you wanted to, or bring your wattage down. Because you do get more performance, you have some overhead to play around with what kind of performance you want to get this way. But 720p is another great option to get even more FPS, run the game really smooth, and this is without frame gen. If we introduce frame gen, you can double that frame rate of what you're seeing now on here, and it works really good at 720p. If we switch over to 900p in these same areas, again, great performance, and I think 900p is probably the sweet spot with or without frame generation that most people would opt to play at here on the Ally X with God of War Ragnarok. Again, I just wanted to showcase a game finally that we can actually play really decently, a AAA PC port at 1080p, but I do believe 900p here at 20 to 25 watts, low medium FSR 3.1 quality with or without frame gen, it's definitely going to be a great way to play God of War Ragnarok here on the Ally X as well. It's really smooth, picture quality is really great, and again, pretty impressed with this PC port, especially coming off the Final Fantasy 16 testing, which, while I love that game, the PC port is still a bit of a mess in my opinion and needs some patches to smooth out that performance and stutter in that game. Now let's go into frame generation. In-game frame gen is a great option here. They essentially double our frame rate, and it works really well in God of War. This has been working great in newer games that have had FSR 3 and FSR 3.1. I've been using it a lot lately in Cyberpunk, Black Myth Wukong, here in God of War. In the future, future. Space Marine 2 should get it, and I'll use it there. It's really been great implementation of FrameGen into these games, and you can see how smooth the performance here is. Now, screen capture here isn't V-synced or anything, and doesn't have VRR, so you're going to see some weird stuttery look and all of that, but you'll see when we get to playing on the actual Ally here in a little bit that that's not there, and the VRR screen lends itself really well to the in-game FrameGen here and offers a pretty smooth experience with very little added input latency. Yeah, it's there and I can tell, but for a single player game like this, I think this is a great way to be able to play God of War Ragnarok with in-game frame generation, with the 1080p, the upscaling. You're kind of using all the features from AMD here on this AMD device and getting the most out of what so far is a clean PC port for God of War Ragnarok. Now switching over to some footage right here on the Ally X, so you can actually see this running with frame generation on the VRR screen of the Ally X at 1080p being upscaled here, and it looks great. It's really clean. Most of you that have used FSR 3.1 have seen the upgrades to what the upscaling does. It's better than what we had when we were still getting 2.1 features in the 3.0 FSR, and it's really clean, and the frame gen is working out really well. Very minimal artifacting and ghosting and input latency, and again, just on the screen, even though it may not be perfect, it looks really good. And again, I think for a single player game like this, if you want to push those frames, it's a great way to go. But also with the good upscaling of FSR 3.1, you could just run it without frame gen as well, and it looks great here. Anyways, guys, that's the video focused on 1080p 25 watt performance here on the ROG Ally X for God of War Ragnarok. Certainly 720p and 900p will be a better option for a lot of people, especially if you want to run lower wattage, save some battery, and that type of thing. But I think this was a good way to showcase a game finally where I could take advantage of the native display, at least using FSR anyways, not native 1080p, but still looking great on the device. Alright guys, thanks a lot for coming and check out the video. As always, I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.